I was being erased. First from the Christmas photo, then the vacation album. My daughter-in-law cut me out frame by frame, my son silent beside her. At the dinner meant to finalize my quiet exit, my late husband's business partner made one phone call. The family that forgot me suddenly remembered my name, because I held the controlling share of the company that employed them all, and I could end their world with a single signature. Her name is Bet. For 2 years after her husband's death, she watched her son's wife systematically delete her from the family, cropped photos, separate holiday tables, whispered conversations about when the old woman would finally step aside. But what no one else at that dinner table knew is that her late husband had structured his business empire so that Bet, not her son, held the controlling stake. This is the story of a family that tried to erase a widow, and the single phone call that forced them to remember exactly who she was. Bet remembered the exact moment the erasure began. It was the first Christmas after Charles died. The family photo from that year shows her on the edge, almost out of frame, her shoulder half gone. The next year, she was invisible, cropped out entirely, replaced by the gleaming tree and Miranda's bright smile. At first, she told herself it was an accident, a photography mistake. But the accidents multiplied. A Thanksgiving seat at the children's table while the adults laughed in the dining room. A vacation album where her face had been carefully trimmed from every group shot. Birthday gatherings where she was invited the day after, as if she were an afterthought. Miranda was editing Bet out of her own lineage, frame by frame, and her son Andrew held the scissors. The house that evening was a monument to the life Miranda wanted the world to see. Vaulted ceilings, cold marble floors, caterers in white gloves circulating with champagne. It was supposedly a dinner to discuss the future of Charles Bennett's firm, Bennett Logistics, the company he had built from a single truck into a regional empire. 43 years of early mornings and late nights, 270 employees. And now, 2 years after his heart stopped in the parking lot of that same headquarters, his family sat in a room that his money had built, but his memory had been scrubbed from. Bet was placed at the far end of the table, a plate of untouched salmon before her. Andrew sat at the head, Miranda to his right, her designer dress shifting under the chandelier light. They chatted about the summer home they were planning, the private school applications for grandchildren who were still hypothetical, the Paris trip that had been absolutely essential for Miranda's brand partnerships. Bet was not included in any conversation. She was furniture. A portrait of a forgotten founder hung on the wall. Charles, younger, smiling. And even that picture seemed to be positioned so no one had to look directly at it. Andrew's voice cut through the murmur when the dessert plates were cleared. He tapped his fork against his glass. So, Mom, Miranda and I have been talking. About the future. About you. His tone was careful, rehearsed. Miranda squeezed his hand under the table. Andrew continued, "You've been in that big house alone for 2 years now. The stairs, the yard, the upkeep. It's too much for someone your age. We think it's time you moved into a community. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you don't have to worry." He said safe like a leash. Bet knew the script by heart. She had seen it play out with her own mother, years ago, when a different daughter-in-law had suggested a retirement village that was really a one-room apartment with emergency pull cords and a shared dining hall. She had watched her mother shrink into silence and die within 3 years. Now, the same choreography was rehearsing on her. The only difference was that this time, they didn't just want her house. They wanted her shares. Her silence. Her disappearance. Miranda leaned forward, her red nails framing her wine glass. "We're not being cruel, Bet. We care about you. But the company needs fresh leadership. Andrew has vision, but the board won't take him seriously as long as you're holding the voting stake. If you were to transfer it to him, he could finally make the moves your husband would have wanted. And you could relax. No more fighting. No more pressure. She smiled the same smile she used in every cropped photo. Bet said nothing. Her silence was not weakness. It was the discipline of a woman who had spent 44 years married to a strategist. Charles had taught her that the most dangerous person in a negotiation is the one who listens more than she talks. So she listened. She listened to Andrew explain how they'd found a lovely assisted living facility, Sunset Hills, 30 miles from the city, with a waiting list and a brochure full of stock photos of gray-haired women laughing at nothing. She listened to Miranda describe how the house sale would cover the entrance fee, how Bet would be comfortable, how the shares would be placed in a trust for Andrew to manage. She listened, and she counted the number of times her husband's name was spoken aloud. 0. Charles Bennett had been erased from the room as thoroughly as she had been from the family photographs. Then the doorbell rang. The caterer opened it, and Richard Vance walked in. He was 71, silver-haired, with a limp from a Vietnam mine, and he carried his suit jacket over his arm. Richard had been Charles's business partner for 34 years. They had started Bennett Logistics together in a rented garage, built it through oil crises and recessions, and never once had a formal contract between them, only a handshake. When Charles died, Richard stood at the funeral and wept without shame. Now he nodded at Bet with an expression she couldn't read, and he took the seat beside her without being asked. The family assumed he was there to manage the frail widow. Miranda's voice went a shade too cheerful. Richard, so glad you could join us. We were just talking about the transition. Andrew's been working on the numbers. Richard said nothing. He looked at Bet. May I speak with you privately? His voice was low, but it carried. Miranda exchanged a glance with Andrew. Andrew shrugged. Of course, we'll be in the living room. They retreated, confident that the gentle old man was going to help them tidy away the last obstacle. Richard pulled out his phone. Bet watched him scroll to a contact, then press the call button. He held it to his ear. The room quieted. From the living room, Miranda's laughter stopped. Richard said, I need to confirm the share structure. Yes, this is Richard Vance. The Charles Bennett estate. Exactly. Read me the controlling interest designation. His eyes never left Bet's. The voice on the other end spoke words that only he could hear. And then Richard nodded. Thank you. That's all I needed. He ended the call. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Andrew appeared in the doorway, Miranda behind him, both frozen. Richard placed the phone on the table, its screen still lit with the name of the law firm, and looked at the woman they had tried to erase. Charles made sure you would never be forgotten, he said. Your husband didn't leave you a seat at the table. He left you the entire table. And outside, the wind stirred, as if the man who built the empire had just walked back into the room. I watched Miranda's face as Richard's words landed. The smile she'd worn all evening, the one that said she'd already won, froze and cracked at the edges. Her eyes flicked from Richard to me, then to Andrew, calculating, recalculating. She had spent 2 years moving chess pieces, and in one phone call, an old man with a limp had flipped the board. Andrew stood motionless, his mouth slightly open, a son who had just realized he'd bet everything on the wrong horse. The silence stretched until Richard picked up his phone and placed it in his jacket pocket with the deliberate calm of a man who had seen real combat and knew that dinner parties were not it. He looked at me, not at them. Charles set it up 8 months before he died, he said, as if we were alone. The company recapitalized. All voting shares converted to a single class, and the controlling block was placed in a trust. You are the sole trustee, Bet. Andrew's shares are non-voting. He has a salary, a title, an office with his name on the door, but he can't hire a janitor or move the coffee budget without your signature. And the trust is irrevocable. No one can break it, not even you, unless you die or choose to resign. And if you die, the shares don't go to your son. They go to the Bennett Family Foundation, a charitable organization you control until your last breath. He let that sink in. Charles made certain that your son's wife could never get her hands on the empire. He also made sure that if anyone tried to have you declared incompetent, the Foundation's independent board would step in and freeze all assets until a court reviewed the case. He thought of everything. Miranda's voice came out wound tight, barely controlled. This is absurd. Bet is 74 years old. She's not capable of running a logistics company. The board will never accept this. Richard turned to her with the slow, patient gaze of a man who had buried more friends than she had Instagram followers. The board works for the shareholders, Miranda, and the controlling shareholder is sitting right here. She can fire every single one of them tomorrow morning, including Andrew. Andrew flinched. His face, which had been pale, now took on a grayish hue. He reached for a chair and sat down heavily, his designer suit crumpling. I remembered a night 23 years ago when Charles came home late from the office. He'd been quiet that week, more tired than usual. I made him tea, and he sat at our kitchen table, the one with the burn mark from a hot skillet. And he said, "I'm worried about Andrew. He's a good boy, but he's soft. He wants to be liked more than he wants to be right. And the kind of woman who goes looking for a man to save her from her own ambition, she'll eat him alive." I told him he was being dramatic. He smiled that half smile that meant he'd already started planning for disaster even as he hoped for calm seas. Now I realized that the recapitalization, the trust, the foundation, the board, all of it was Charles building a ship that could survive the iceberg he'd seen coming before the rest of us had even noticed the fog. Richard took an envelope from his inside pocket and placed it on the table beside my untouched dessert plate. "There's more," he said. "But I think you'll want to read this part alone." Miranda lunged forward, her red nails snatching the envelope before I could move. She tore it open, and a stack of photographs spilled across the marble floor. I saw her face, her real face, the one the cameras didn't get, twist. One photo showed her at a wedding. Not her wedding to Andrew. A different groom, older, silver-haired, with a hand on her hip. Another showed a newspaper clipping, "Family business sold without consent, daughter-in-law disappears." A third was a marriage certificate from Arizona, 2016. The bride's name wasn't Miranda. Andrew bent to pick up a photograph. He stared at it, his hands shaking. "Miranda, who is this?" She snatched it away, but her voice was already fraying. "That's nothing. Some desperate old man who wanted to pay me to be his date. It's not what you think." Richard didn't look at her. He looked at me. Charles hired a private investigator after Miranda started asking about the share structure 2 months into the engagement. What you see there is evidence of 2 previous marriages that ended with the husband's elderly parents losing their homes and their life savings. Miranda Court, that's her legal name, not the one she gave Andrew, has been doing this for over a decade. She marries men with family businesses, isolates the older relatives, pushes them out, and then liquidates everything. The pattern is identical. Each time, the widow or widower ends up in a facility, cut off from their family, and the money vanishes offshore. Andrew recoiled from his wife. She turned to him, her composure collapsing into something desperate and ugly. "I love you," she said, her voice cracking. "Everything was going to be fine. Your mother was supposed to be taken care of. We just needed the shares. I was protecting you. She's old, Andrew. She doesn't belong in that big house. She's a liability. I did this for us." The words hung in the air like smoke, and in them, I heard what she truly believed. That I was not a person, not a mother, not a woman who had loved a man for 4 decades. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to her ambition. I was a checkbox on a to-do list. I stood up, And for the first time that evening, every eye in the room was on me not as an inconvenience, but as the person holding the only weapon that mattered. My hand went to the envelope Richard had brought. Inside was a letter in Charles's handwriting. I didn't need to read it yet, but knowing it was there, his voice still speaking to me, gave me a steadiness I hadn't felt since the funeral. I looked at my son. You sat at your father's desk and let her edit me out of your life, one photograph at a time. You signed off on selling my home, on putting me in a facility, on erasing me. And you never once asked yourself why your father had structured the company the way he did. Andrew's eyes were wet. Mom, I didn't know. I thought you thought I was just your mother. That love was a weakness she could exploit. But you forgot something. Your father didn't just teach me how to love. He taught me how to win. Miranda's mask fully shattered. She grabbed Andrew's arm. She can't do this. We have rights. We'll challenge the trust. We'll prove she's incompetent. She forgot my name last week, Andrew. You were there. She's losing it. She was grasping, and the falseness of her tears was as obvious as the Botox in her forehead. Richard didn't move. He just pulled out his phone again and dialed a number. Detective Garcia? Yes, it's Richard Vance. The Bennett case. I'm here with the family, and we have physical evidence of the prior marriages and the financial fraud. The suspect is present. Yes, I'll hold the line. Miranda's face went white. She stepped back, her designer heels clicking on the marble like a countdown. Andrew looked at the pictures scattered on the floor, at the evidence of the woman he'd married, and something broke in his expression. He didn't move toward her. He didn't defend her. He just stood there, hollowed out, the realization dawning that he had been a mark all along. And in that terrible stillness, I saw my son for the first time in 2 years, not the puppet Miranda had crafted, but the boy who used to sit in the garage with his father, turning wrenches and asking questions about how engines worked. He was still in there, buried under debt and manipulation and the poison of a woman who had never loved him. I picked up one of the photographs, the newspaper clipping. It detailed a couple in Phoenix, a widow named Margaret who had been removed from her home of 30 years after her son's new wife convinced him she was a danger to herself. The house sold, the money gone. The widow dead within 18 months of a broken heart. I held the clipping toward Andrew. Read it, I said. This is what she planned for me, and you were going to help her. He took it with trembling hands. Miranda started to scream, not words, just noise, the sound of an animal whose trap had snapped shut. She lunged for the envelope, but Richard stepped in front of me with that slow, immovable presence. I think it's time you left, he said. But she didn't leave. She ran to her purse, yanked out her own phone, and started dialing, her fingers slipping on the screen. I'm calling my lawyer, she hissed. You think some podunk investigator in Tampa is going to scare me? I have connections. I'll sue you for defamation, for elder abuse, for theft. She was panting now, her perfect hair coming undone. And then her phone pinged. She glanced down, and the color drained from her face completely. The message was visible to anyone close. Linda Marsh? We know who you are. Phoenix PD has the warrant. Running isn't an option. The name Linda Marsh wasn't familiar to me, but Richard's nod told me everything. Not Miranda Court, not Miranda whatever she had told Andrew. Linda Marsh. A stolen identity. A criminal past that even the investigator hadn't fully unearthed. Something fresh. Something that would send her to prison for a very long time. She stood frozen, the phone shaking in her hand, and in that moment, the entire family understood that the woman who had tried to erase me was not a social climber, but a fugitive. And she had just been caught, not by the police arriving at the door, but by the ghost of my husband reaching from beyond the grave to protect what he loved. Andrew's voice was a whisper. Who is Linda Marsh? He looked at Miranda, and the question wasn't rhetorical. He really didn't know. She had played him so completely that he was asking for her real name as if it were the name of a stranger. And maybe, to him, it was. The marriage, the love, the future they'd whispered about in the dark, all of it was built on a fiction. The house I stood in, the company his father built, the legacy I'd been fighting to preserve, were the only truths left. I reached across the table and took Andrew's hand. He didn't pull away. His palm was cold and damp. But I held on. We have a lot to talk about, I said quietly. But first, we need to decide what to do with her. Outside, the faint sound of sirens rose in the distance, closing in on our address like the final stroke of a pen. The family that had tried to erase me now faced a choice, and my son, for the first time in 2 years, looked at me not as a burden, but as his mother. And that, I realized, was what my husband had really been protecting. Not just shares, not just a house, but the possibility that a boy lost in the fog of a predator's charm could still find his way home. The sirens crested the hill and cut their wail as 2 patrol cars turned into the long driveway. Gravel crunched under tires. Richard walked to the front door and opened it without waiting for the bell. 2 officers stepped inside, a detective in plain clothes behind them. I recognized the detective from Richard's description, Detective Garcia, a solid woman with graying hair and the calm eyes of someone who had seen every con artist's trick. She scanned the room, took in the photographs scattered on the floor, the broken mask on Miranda's face, my son standing shell-shocked, and me still holding his hand. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, nodding at me. "Mr. Vance filled us in. We've been building a case for 3 weeks. The Phoenix warrant gave us enough to move." Miranda backed toward the wall. "This is a mistake. I'm a victim here. These people are trying to steal my marriage, my life. Andrew, tell them." But Andrew didn't speak. He was still staring at the marriage certificate from Arizona, the name that wasn't hers. Detective Garcia stepped forward, handcuffs already in her grip. "Linda Marsh, you are under arrest for identity theft, fraud, and elder exploitation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Miranda's composure shattered into something feral. She grabbed a wine glass from the table and threw it at the detective, then bolted for the back door. But Richard had already moved. He blocked the hallway, and the officers were on her in seconds, pinning her arms behind her back as she screamed. The sound was animal, high, unhinged, the cry of a predator who had never once considered she might be prey. Andrew watched it all, and I watched him. He was crying without making a sound, tears sliding down his cheeks into his collar. I wanted to go to him, but I knew that this moment, his wife being handcuffed and read her rights, was a wall that had to fall, and I could not be the one to hold it up. He had to stand there and let it crumble. After they put Miranda in the patrol car, Detective Garcia stayed. She knelt and started collecting the photographs with gloved hands, bagging them. "We'll need statements from both of you. But first, there's something else you should know." She pulled out her phone, swiped to a document. The Phoenix warrant wasn't just for identity theft. Linda Marsh, that's her real name, is wanted for the suspicious death of her second husband, George Murphy. The room went cold. Andrew's head snapped up. "Death?" Detective Garcia nodded. George Murphy was 61. Married her in 2021. 8 months later, he was found dead in his home, an apparent heart attack. No autopsy was performed at the time because the family doctor signed off on natural causes. But after the widow disappeared with the proceeds from the sale of his business, his children pushed for exhumation. They found traces of a digitalis-based compound. It's a difficult substance to detect unless you're looking for it. Linda Marsh had access to his medications. She increased his dosage over weeks, mimicking cardiac decline. The case had gone cold until we started connecting the dots from your husband's investigator. Richard's face was stone. Charles found that connection? He did, the detective said. Peter Coleman, the PI your husband hired, is the one who flagged the Murphy case to us. We're flying him in tomorrow. I lowered myself into the chair, my knees suddenly weak. Charles hadn't just been investigating financial fraud. He'd been tracking a killer. And he'd died before he could finish the job. My husband's final months, those hours he'd spent at his desk, the calls he'd taken in the garage, the strain I'd attributed to work, had been a race against a woman he knew was capable of murder. I reached into my pocket where I'd tucked his letter, still unread, and felt the weight of his words waiting for me. Andrew spoke, his voice cracked and raw. She was going to do the same to me. To Mom. Detective Garcia didn't sugarcoat it. Given the pattern, yes, once your mother was out of the way and the shares were transferred, you would have become a liability. A husband who might ask questions, who might eventually see the truth. The Paris trip she was planning wasn't just a vacation. It was an escape route. We found flight bookings to Costa Rica under a different alias, one-way tickets, purchased 2 days ago. She had already started moving money into an offshore account. Andrew, your credit cards were maxed out. $32,000 across 3 new accounts she opened in your name without your knowledge. She was burning your financial future down as she walked out the door. Andrew stumbled to the sofa and sank into it, his head in his hands. I went to him. This time, he reached for me. Detective Garcia left us for a moment, stepping outside to coordinate with the officers. Richard poured 3 glasses of water and set them on the table. There's more about the company, he said quietly. Charles didn't just protect the voting shares. He also built in a poison pill. If anyone attempts a hostile takeover or fraudulent transfer of control, a clause is triggered that converts all assets into the foundation's name and dismantles the operating business within 90 days. It was designed to make Bennett Logistics worthless to anyone who tried to steal it. The only way the company survives is if the family remains intact. Your husband made the enterprise a hostage to your relationships. If you and Andrew couldn't find your way back to each other, everything would be lost. He trusted that you would. That was Charles, always playing the long game. Always believing that love, when tested to its breaking point, would hold if you built the right supports around it. He had set a trap that would destroy his own life's work unless his wife and son learned to trust each other again. And tonight, with Miranda in handcuffs and the truth laid bare, we had taken the first step. The next morning, Peter Coleman arrived. He was a compact man with the watchful eyes of a retired detective. He met us at my house, the house Miranda had tried to sell. He brought a box of files. Your husband hired me 18 months before he died, Peter said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. He had noticed anomalies in the company's travel expenses, small amounts, but recurring. A flight to Phoenix, she claimed, was for a yoga retreat. A rental car in Tampa for a friend's wedding. He started digging, and what he found was a trail of destroyed families. Peter opened a folder and pointed to a timeline. First known victim, a man named Harold Chen in San Diego, 2014. She was 26. Married him, convinced him to sell his father's restaurant, then vanished with $140,000. Harold's father had a stroke when he learned the money was gone. He never recovered. Second victim, Stanley Wright Phoenix, 2016. Mother lost her home, died in a care facility. Third, George Murphy, Tampa, 2021. Fatal, fourth, and now you. Peter pulled out a photograph, a glossy 8x10 of Miranda, younger, with Harold Chen. She changes her hair, her name, her accent. But the pattern never varies. She researches widowers or men who stand to inherit family assets, isolates them from their support system, then pushes the elderly relative out. Your husband was the first person who caught on before she finished the cycle. He confronted her once. Carefully, she denied everything. But she must have known he was a threat. Charles died of a heart attack 6 weeks later. He paused, and the implication was as heavy as a stone in my chest. The Phoenix medical examiner is re-examining his case. Mrs. Bennett, your husband's symptoms in the days before his death were consistent with digitalis toxicity. Nausea, confusion, visual disturbances. He complained of those to his doctor, but they were attributed to stress. We may never know for certain, but I want you to be prepared for what the investigation might uncover. Andrew made a sound, a wounded noise from the back of his throat. I reached across the table and took his hand again. If she killed your father, she will answer for it, I said, and my voice was steel. Peter nodded. The evidence from the Murphy case is strong. If the toxicology review on Charles shows anything, the district attorney will add charges. She's looking at life without parole. That afternoon, we began the process of untangling the financial web. Peter connected us with a forensic accountant who discovered that Miranda had not only maxed out Andrew's credit, but had also secured a home equity line of credit on our house using forged documents. She had siphoned almost $90,000 into a shell corporation registered in Nevada. Richard put our legal team on it. By nightfall, the bank had frozen the accounts, and the foundation's board had convened an emergency meeting to stabilize the company. Andrew sat in on the call, silent, absorbing the reality of what had almost happened. When it ended, he turned to me. I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything, for the photos, for the dinners, for not listening. His voice broke. Dad knew. He tried to warn me, and I told him he was paranoid. The last words I ever said to him were, "Stay out of my life." I told him what I knew Charles would have said, that a father's love doesn't keep score, and that the best apology is to build the future he designed for us. The next week, the story broke nationally. News outlets picked up the daughter-in-law con angle, and suddenly other victims surfaced. A woman in Colorado called to say her son's ex-wife had done something similar, and she'd never reported it because she was too ashamed. A support group formed online. The foundation received inquiries from financial advisors wanting to help families structure protections like the one Charles had built. Andrew gave his statement to the police and to the district attorney. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. But as the days passed, I saw him start to straighten, losing the hunch of shame, finding the spark of purpose again. 2 weeks after the arrest, I finally sat alone in the garage, Dennis's old workbench, no, Charles's workbench, and opened his letter. His handwriting was steady, careful, the same hand that had held mine through 100 storms. My love, he wrote. If you are reading this, the plan has activated. I know you are strong enough to handle whatever comes. I have faith in you, and I have faith in Andrew. The road back will be hard for him. Please don't give up on our son. He is not bad, he is merely lost. The foundation I built was never about money. It was about giving you the power to remain free, and the leverage to bring him back to himself. Take care of each other. I am still with you, in every asset, every clause, every memory. Yours, Charles. I folded the letter and pressed it to my heart, and I cried the tears I'd held back since the funeral. But this time, they weren't only tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a love that had outlasted death itself. My husband had given me the keys to the kingdom, but he had also given me the chance to restore my family. And now, with Miranda awaiting trial and Andrew beginning therapy, the final chapter of the story was about to unfold. One that would test whether the company could thrive again, whether a mother and son could heal, and whether the legacy of a man who loved them both would truly endure. The choice was ours. 3 months after Miranda's arrest, the trial began. The courthouse was a gray stone building downtown, the same one where Charles had once served jury duty. I walked through those doors with Andrew on my left and Richard on my right. The hallway smelled of floor wax and old paper. Courtroom 4B was already packed with journalists, the kind who had spent weeks calling my house for comment. I had said nothing. I was saving my words for the witness stand. Miranda entered in an orange jumpsuit. Her hair had lost its shine, and her face, stripped of expensive makeup, was harder, older. She saw us, and her eyes moved over Andrew as if he were a stranger. She showed no remorse, no cracks. That would become the prosecution's entire case, the sheer, unblinking calculation of a woman who had left a trail of broken families and dead men behind her and had never once looked back. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Torres, called Stanley Wright first. He flew in from Phoenix. I watched him take the stand, a man in his late 50s with hands that trembled on the Bible as he swore to tell the truth. He told the courtroom about his mother, about the house she lost, about the assisted living facility she died in. He described Miranda as charming, patient, so kind at first. Then, he described the slow erosion, the whispered doubts, the isolation, the house sale. By the time he stepped down, 3 jurors were wiping their eyes. George Murphy's son testified next. He was a tall man with his father's jawline. He described the exhumation, the pathologist's findings, the digitalis compound that had been disguised by his father's heart medication. He read aloud a letter his father had written before his death, asking him to look after the auto shop. The shop Miranda had sold. When he finished, the courtroom was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. But the moment that broke the room came when the medical examiner took the stand. The prosecution had requested a retrospective toxicology review of Charles's tissue samples, preserved from the autopsy. The pathologist adjusted the microphone and said digitalis glycosides were present at levels consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning over several weeks. The cause of death should have been listed as homicide. I gripped Andrew's arm so hard I left marks. My husband had been murdered. The man who had built his whole life around protecting me, around protecting his son, had been killed by the very predator he was trying to unmask. I did not cry. I stored the rage somewhere deep and cold, a place I would visit later. When Miranda took the stand in her own defense, she played the victim. Her lawyer tried to argue that Linda Marsh was a separate personality, a trauma response from an abusive childhood. But Angela Torres was ready. She presented the evidence Charles had gathered, the photographs, the marriage certificates, the offshore accounts. She played a recording of a call Miranda had made from jail to a man in Costa Rica, arranging to transfer the remaining funds. And then she asked Miranda one question. If you truly loved Andrew, why did you open 3 credit cards in his name and max them out before you ever planned to leave the country? Miranda's answer was a single word: necessity. The jury was out for 3 hours. They returned with guilty on all counts: identity theft, grand theft, elder exploitation, and 2 counts of first-degree murder: George Murphy and Charles Bennett. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Andrew stood beside me as the gavel fell. He was crying openly, the kind of tears that didn't ask for permission. I held his hand, and I felt something shift between us. The wall that Miranda had built, brick by brick, was finally crumbling. And in that courtroom, with the woman who had tried to erase me now erased herself from our lives forever, we began the real work of healing. The months that followed were not easy. Andrew moved back into my house, our house, and took over the garage apartment. He started therapy twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 5 o'clock. Some evenings he would come upstairs and sit with me while I cooked dinner, and we would talk about small things: the weather, a movie he'd seen, a funny story from his childhood. Other evenings he would go straight to his room and I wouldn't see him until morning. I learned that grief and recovery were not a straight line. The business needed attention too. The poison pill clause Richard had described was real, but it could be diffused if the family worked together. I called a meeting of the board and introduced Andrew as the new head of operations, a probationary position I made clear with oversight from Richard and a mentorship plan. Andrew accepted with humility. He stood in the boardroom, the same room where his father had once taught him to read a balance sheet, and he said, "I have a lot to prove. I know that. I'm ready to start." The first year was grueling. Andrew worked 12-hour days, learning routes, renegotiating contracts, earning the trust of drivers and warehouse managers. I came into the office 3 days a week, not to micromanage, but to be present. I wanted the employees to see that the Bennett family was still standing. I wanted them to know that the company wasn't just a set of assets on a spreadsheet, it was the legacy of a man who had believed in second chances. And as Andrew grew stronger, I began to let go. Not all at once. I would never be foolish again, but I transferred a small block of voting shares into his name, just enough to give him skin in the game. The foundation remained intact, its independent board a permanent safeguard. Charles had taught me that trust must be earned, not gifted, and Andrew understood that now. On the 1-year anniversary of Miranda's sentencing, I went to the office early and opened the safe in Charles's old study. Inside, beneath a stack of old ledgers, I found a sealed envelope with Andrew's name on it. I had never seen it before. I called Andrew and asked him to come. When he arrived, I handed him the envelope without a word. He opened it slowly, his hands steady now, and pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. It was dated the year Andrew graduated from college. Charles's handwriting was younger here, sharper. It read, "Andrew, if you are reading this, it means you found your way back. I knew you would. You are my son, and you have always had a good heart. Sometimes a good heart gets lost in the dark, but the sun always rises. I am so proud of you. The company is yours, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. Take care of your mother. Take care of yourself. I will always be watching. Love, Dad." Andrew sank into the chair, the letter trembling in his hands. I knelt beside him and put my arm around his shoulders. He read it twice, then 3 times, and then he said, "I wish I could tell him I'm sorry." I told him that Charles already knew. That a father's love didn't need an apology, it needed only the proof of a life well lived. And in the year since the trial, Andrew had begun to provide that proof. The following spring, the Bennett Family Foundation launched a program called Safe Harbor, dedicated to protecting elderly parents from financial exploitation. We partnered with legal aid clinics and financial advisors, and we told our story openly. Stanley Wright became a board member. George Murphy's son contributed to a memorial fund, and I began speaking at community centers, telling other widows and widowers about the red flags I had missed, the slow isolation, the suggestions of decline, the sudden interest in wills and trusts. At each event, I would hold up a copy of the photographs Miranda had cropped me from, and I would say, "This is not an accident. Isolation is a strategy. If you feel invisible in your own family, speak up. Find your Richard. Find your advocate." Then, on a Sunday morning in early summer, Andrew asked me to meet him at the company headquarters. I arrived to find the parking lot full of cars. He led me inside to the main lobby, where the entire staff, all 270 employees, had gathered. Richard stood at the front, a microphone in his hand. "We have something for you," Andrew said. He walked me to the center of the room. On the wall, where a generic landscape had hung for years, a new portrait had been unveiled. It was a painting of Charles and me, standing side by side, his hand on my shoulder. Beneath it was a plaque, in honor of Bet Bennett, who held the line. I broke down then, for the first time in public, and I didn't try to stop it. Andrew handed me a small box. Inside was a key. "It's to the executive office," he said. "Your office now, if you want it." We all voted. We want you here, not as a figurehead, but as the heart of this place. I looked out at the faces around me, the drivers, the accountants, the warehouse crew, the people Charles had spent his life building something for, and I accepted. But there was one more surprise. Later that week, Richard called me to his office and slid a document across the desk. It was a life insurance policy Charles had taken out in the final year of his life, with a double indemnity clause for accidental or homicidal death. The amount, after taxes, was $4.2 million. Richard explained that Charles had intentionally kept it secret from everyone, including me, so that Miranda would not see it as a target. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him by violence, he wanted you to have complete financial independence regardless of the company. He wanted you to be untouchable. I used a portion of that money to endow the Safe Harbor program permanently. Another portion I divided between Stanley Wright's family and George Murphy's children, not as charity, but as restitution from a man who would have wanted to make things right. The remaining funds I placed in a trust for any future Bennett grandchildren, a future that now seemed possible again. A year and a half after Miranda's arrest, Andrew met someone. Her name was Claire, a logistics analyst from a competing firm who had no idea who he was when they first talked at a conference. She was warm and funny, and didn't smile with her teeth like a predator sizing up prey. I watched their relationship unfold with cautious optimism, and I saw that Andrew was different now. He listened more, he asked questions, he held no secrets. When he brought her to dinner at the house, I set the table in the dining room, the same table where Miranda had once relegated me to the far end. This time, I sat at the head. Claire looked at the family photographs on the wall, the ones where I was no longer cropped out, and she said, "You have a beautiful family." Andrew caught my eye and smiled. And so the company thrived. The foundation grew. The house, once quiet and full of grief, filled again with laughter and the aroma of pot roast on Sundays. Andrew and I restored the garage, the same garage where Charles had once taught him to change oil. We hung his tools on a pegboard, we kept his work journal on a shelf, and in the center of that space, we placed a single framed photograph of the three of us. Taken at a company picnic years ago with Charles's arm around both of us, his smile as wide as his dreams. The ghost of my husband never really left that house. But he was no longer a haunting. He was a foundation. And every time I walked past his portrait in the lobby, I remembered his words, "I am still protecting you." He was. Not through shares or clauses, but through the love he had built into the architecture of our lives, a love that had survived betrayal, murder, and the slow erasure of time. And now, standing in the center of the life he had designed for me, I was no longer the woman who had been cropped from the photograph. I was the woman who held the frame. Bette Bennett still has that first cropped photograph, the one from the Christmas after Charles died, where her shoulder is half out of frame. She keeps it in a drawer, not as a bitter memento, but as a reminder of how close she came to disappearing. Today, she sits at the head of a table that once tried to push her away. The company her husband built is thriving. Her son is healed. The woman who tried to erase her is spending the rest of her life in a cell. But the true measure of Bette's victory is not the prison sentence. It is the photograph that now hangs in the company lobby, a portrait of her and Charles, side by side, with a plaque that reads, "She held the line." She is no longer the woman being cut out. She is the one who holds the frame. And she's not alone. The Safe Harbor initiative she started has now trained over 300 professionals to identify and prevent elder exploitation. Each case prevented is a family that didn't have to endure what Bette did. This story is extreme, but the pattern is ordinary. Elder financial abuse costs American families an estimated $28 billion every year. And it rarely starts with a theft. It starts with a question, Mom. Are you sure you're up to handling the finances alone? It grows with a suggestion. Maybe it's time to downsize. And it ends with a signature on a paper the victim never truly understood. The predators don't wear masks. They attend family dinners and bring you flowers on your birthday. Charles Bennett saw the pattern before it reached his wife. He left behind a structure of legal protections, yes, but more importantly, he left behind people who would not look away. Richard Vance, who honored a handshake, Peter Coleman, who kept investigating, and Andrew, who had to lose everything to find himself. They all became the frame that held Bette up when her own family tried to break her. Now, the question is for you. If you were being slowly erased from your own life, one photograph, one conversation, one subtle push at a time, would you recognize it? And would you have the strength to hold the frame? I want to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe to our channel. We share real stories of people who discover that their greatest power comes not when the world counts them out, but when they refuse to be forgotten. Because the person you think is invisible today might be the one who holds the key to everything tomorrow.